There are legends whispered in the darkest corners of the galaxy, stories told in hushed voices about beings who defy death itself, who manipulated the very essence of life, who sought power beyond the comprehension of mortals. Among these legends, few resonate with such dark fascination as the tale of Darth Plagueis the Wise, a being who existed at the intersection of science and sorcery, a master manipulator who operated from the shadows of the galaxy's highest echelons of power, a dark lord whose experiments would echo through generations and reshape the fate of trillions. This is not simply the story of one Sith Lord. This is the chronicle of ambition taken to its ultimate extreme, of knowledge pursued at any cost, of a mind brilliant enough to unlock secrets the Force itself seemed determined to keep hidden. The story of Darth Plagueis begins not with his birth, but with the understanding of what came before him, the ancient lineage he inherited, and the dark destiny he would forge for himself and his apprentice. Long before Plagueis drew his first breath, the Sith had evolved from a fractured, self-destructive order into something far more insidious. 1,000 years before Plagueis would walk the halls of power, a Sith Lord named Darth Bane had witnessed the near extinction of his order. The ancient Brotherhood of Darkness, with its legions of Dark Lords all vying for supremacy, had torn itself apart in endless power struggles. Bane saw the fundamental weakness in their philosophy. Too many Sith meant too many ambitions clashing, too many knives waiting to strike from behind, too much energy wasted on internal conflicts rather than the true enemy, the Jedi Order and the Republic they served. From the ashes of the Brotherhood's destruction, Bane forged something new, something patient, something deadly. The rule of two became the foundation of the new Sith Order. Two there should be, no more, no less. One to embody power, the other to crave it. A master and an apprentice locked in a relationship that was equal parts cooperation and inevitable betrayal. The philosophy was elegant in its brutality. The apprentice would learn from the master, growing stronger with each passing year, until eventually the student surpassed the teacher. At that moment, the apprentice would strike, eliminating the master and taking their place, then finding their own apprentice to continue the cycle. Each generation would theoretically be stronger than the last. Each betrayal would ensure that only the most powerful survived. The weak would fall, the strong would endure, and gradually, inexorably, the Sith would accumulate power while remaining hidden from the Jedi's sight. This was no plan for quick vengeance. This was a scheme that would take centuries to unfold, a patient cultivation of darkness that would grow in the shadows until the moment came to strike at the heart of the Republic itself. Bane called it the Grand Plan, the complete destruction of the Jedi Order, the corruption and collapse of the Republic from within, and the return of the Sith to their rightful place as masters of the galaxy. Every Sith Lord who followed Bane contributed to this grand design, each adding their own piece to the intricate web being woven across the centuries. They infiltrated governments, manipulated economies, funded conflicts, all while remaining completely hidden from Jedi detection. By the time we reached the High Republic era, several hundred years before the fall of the Republic, the Sith had refined their methods to an art form. They operated through intermediaries and shell corporations. They cultivated networks of informants and agents who often had no idea they were serving Sith interests. They learned patience, the hardest lesson for beings who craved power above all else. And through this patient, methodical approach, they began to position themselves for the final moves of the grand plan. This was the world into which Darth Plagueis would be born, a galaxy that appeared to be at peace, where the Jedi stood as guardians of order, where the Republic governed thousands of systems, all unaware that the seeds of their destruction had been planted generations ago and were quietly, steadily taking root. The engineered birth of a Dark Lord, the story of Hago Damask's birth, is not one of chance or natural occurrence. It is a story of manipulation that began before his parents even met, a testament to how far the Sith would go in their pursuit of the perfect vessel for dark side power. The year was somewhere between 147 and 120 years before the Battle of Yavin, though recent revelations suggest Plagueis may have been even older, active during the latter days of the High Republic era, making him potentially over a century old by the time of his death. The Moon were a species perfectly suited to the role Plagueis would eventually play. Tall and thin, with elongated heads and pale skin, they were a people defined by their exceptional mathematical and financial acumen. The Moon homeworld of Moonalinst had become the banking center of the galaxy, and moons occupied positions of tremendous economic influence throughout known space. They were the founders and leaders of the Intergalactic Banking Clan, an organization that would later prove instrumental to the Sith's plans. Moons were known for their cold, calculating nature, their ability to see patterns in complex systems, and their tendency to value logic and profit over emotion. These traits would serve the Sith cause well. On the frozen, mineral-rich world of Magito, a moon named Kar Damask worked as a middle-ranking agent for the banking clan. He was ambitious, force-sensitive though untrained, and possessed exactly the genetic profile that interested Darth Tenebris, the reigning Dark Lord of the Sith at that time. Tenebris was unlike many Sith who came before him. He was a Bith, a species renowned for their exceptional cognitive abilities and scientific minds. Under his civilian identity as Rugus Gnome, Tenebris operated as one of the galaxy's most sought-after starship designers, creating vessels for the wealthy and powerful. This public persona gave him access to the highest levels of society while keeping his true nature completely hidden. But Tenebris was more than just a careful Sith Lord hiding in plain sight. He was obsessed with prediction, with calculating the future through a combination of Sith precognition and mathematical probability. He had developed complex formulas and models using both the Force and cutting-edge Bith computational methods to try to determine the most likely outcomes of various events. Through these calculations, he had come to a startling conclusion. The prophesied Chosen One, the being who would bring balance to the Force, would soon appear in the galaxy. For Tenebris, this represented both the ultimate threat and the ultimate opportunity. If the Chosen One fell under Jedi influence, the Sith could be destroyed forever. But if Tenebris could find a way to possess the Chosen One, to transfer his consciousness into that infinitely powerful body, he could become immortal and invincible. The plan was audacious, even by Sith standards. Through extensive research into ancient Sith techniques and his own scientific experiments, Tenebris believed he had created something he called maxi-chlorians, a retrovirus that could infect midi-chlorians and allow his consciousness to survive beyond the death of his body. But for this plan to work, he needed time. He needed to survive long enough for the chosen one to appear, which his calculations suggested was still decades away. And he needed an apprentice who could survive that long as well, a vessel strong enough in the Force to maintain Tenebrus's consciousness if necessary. This is where Kar Damask entered the picture. Tenebrus had encountered Kar by apparent chance at the High Port Space Center, though in truth, nothing about the meeting was left to chance. Through careful observation and genetic analysis, Tenebrus determined that Kar possessed a midi-chlorian count high enough to father a Force-sensitive child, though not high enough for Kar himself to become a significant Force user. Tenebrus filed this information away, already planning moves that would play out years in the future. Years after that initial meeting, Tenebrus identified another Force-sensitive moon, a female from a lower caste. She was not powerful enough to be considered for a true Sith apprenticeship, but she had potential, and more importantly, she had the right genetic profile. Using methods both subtle and direct, Tenebrus arranged for her to become his disciple, teaching her rudimentary dark side techniques and using her for various purposes. Then, with the cold calculation of a chess master arranged pieces on a board, Tenebrus engineered circumstances that would bring her together with Kar Damask. The Bith had calculated the probable midi-chlorian count of their offspring with mathematical precision. When these two specific individuals reproduced, the resulting child should have exceptional Force potential, exactly what Tenebrus needed for his long-term plans. And so Hego Damask came into being, not through the natural course of events, but as the product of Sith manipulation spanning years of careful planning. Hego was born on Megiddo, in one of the domed cities that protected inhabitants from the perpetually frozen surface of the mineral-rich world. It was not an ideal environment for raising a child. The population was sparse, the climate harsh, even within the environmental controls, and the society was dominated by the cold efficiency that moons brought to everything they did. Hego's mother watched him with an intensity that went beyond normal parental concern. She knew what he was, what he could become, and she understood the significance of the bargain that had been struck. Before Hego reached his 5th birthday, he began exhibiting clear signs of Force sensitivity. Unlike many Force-sensitive children whose abilities manifested as unconscious empathy or precognitive flashes, Hego's power expressed itself in more direct and disturbing ways. He could move small objects with his mind. He could sense the emotions of those around him and learn quickly how to manipulate those feelings to his advantage. He was a child, but already there was something calculating in his gaze, something that suggested an adult intelligence working behind those young eyes. His mother, understanding the nature of the Force and having been taught by Tenebrus himself, recognized these signs immediately. She began instructing Hego to keep his abilities secret, impressing upon him that the galaxy was not ready to know what he was capable of. She confided in him that they shared this gift, this connection to a power that most beings could never understand. For young Hego, these conversations were formative. He learned early that he was different, that he possessed capabilities that set him apart from and above the common beings around him. But the true darkness in Hego's nature revealed itself through an incident that his mother witnessed with a mixture of horror and dark pride. There was another moon child in their community, a boy who had somehow earned young Hego's displeasure. The exact nature of the offense has been lost to history. Perhaps it was nothing more than a perceived slight or simple childish antagonism. Whatever the cause, Hego decided to test the limits of his power in a way that revealed the depths of cruelty he was capable of, even at such a young age. Using a mind trick of exceptional potency, far beyond what a child his age should have been capable of wielding, Hego reached into the other boy's mind. He twisted thoughts, planted suggestions, and fundamentally altered the child's perceptions and desires. The unfortunate victim, his will completely subverted by Hego's dark manipulation, walked calmly to a high window in one of the city's towers. Without hesitation, without any external sign of coercion, the boy jumped, plummeted to his death in the courtyard below. Hego's mother found her son watching the aftermath with cold interest, observing the reactions of adults discovering the body, noting the panic and confusion that spread through the community. When she confronted him, demanding to know what he had done, Hego explained his actions with a matter-of-fact tone of someone describing a scientific experiment. He had wanted to see if he could do it. He had wanted to know how far his power extended. The other child had been weak-willed, easy to manipulate, a perfect test subject for Hego's expanded abilities. Rather than punishing her son or trying to instill some moral framework that might have steered him away from the darkest impulses, Hego's mother simply reinforced the need for secrecy. She warned him to be more careful to ensure that he couldn't be connected to such incidents. She was, after all, a disciple of Darth Tenebrous, and she understood that such displays of power, while impressive, needed to remain hidden from public view. The Sith way required patience, required operating from the shadows until the moment was right to reveal oneself. Soon after this incident, Hego's parents made a decision that would reshape his life and ultimately the fate of the galaxy. They handed their son over to Rugus Gnome, ostensibly as a reward for Kar's career advancement. Tenebrous, through his extensive network and influence, had arranged for Kar to be promoted to director of the Treasury branch of the Intergalactic Banking Clan. It was Kar's dream position, the culmination of years of ambition and work. In exchange for this advancement, his Force-sensitive son would become Gnome's apprentice, would leave Mygeeto forever, and would begin training in abilities Kar could only imagine. For Kar Damask, this seemed like an acceptable exchange, perhaps even a fortunate one. His son would be trained by one of the galaxy's most respected beings, would gain access to opportunities far beyond anything Mygeeto could offer. What Kar didn't know, could never have known, was that he was handing his child over to the Dark Lord of the Sith, that Rugus Gnome was merely a public face worn by Darth Tenebrous, and that his son had been specifically bred for this purpose. When Tenebrous took custody of young Hego Damask, he bestowed upon the child a title that would resonate through galactic history. No longer would he be simply Hego Damask, the child of Moonalinced banking agents. Now, he was Darth Plagueis, apprentice to the Dark Lord of the Sith, heir to a legacy of darkness stretching back 1,000 years, and a key piece in Tenebrous's grand design to possess the Chosen One and rule the galaxy forever. For Plagueis, leaving Mygito represented his first glimpse of the wider galaxy and the beginning of a journey that would take him to heights of power few beings could imagine, and eventually to a death that would become legend. Under the shadow of Darth Tenebris. The early years of Plagueis' apprenticeship were marked by a unique and unsettling dynamic between master and apprentice. Unlike many Sith training relationships, which were characterized by the master pouring knowledge and power into the apprentice to create a worthy successor who would eventually overthrow them, Tenebris had different plans for Plagueis. The young Moon was not being trained to become the next Dark Lord in the traditional sense. He was being cultivated as a vessel, a body that could sustain Tenebris' consciousness until the Chosen One appeared. This fundamental misalignment of purpose would shape everything about their relationship. Tenebris was not invested in Plagueis' growth as a Sith Lord in his own right. Instead, the Bith Master sent his apprentice on missions he considered ultimately pointless, tasks designed more to keep Plagueis occupied and tested than to genuinely prepare him for leadership. These missions ranged from mundane intelligence gathering to targeted assassinations, each carefully calibrated to develop Plagueis' abilities without allowing him to grow too powerful too quickly. Tenebris operated in the galaxy under two distinct identities, each carefully maintained and kept separate from the other. As Ruga's gnome, he was a celebrity within certain elite circles, a starship designer whose vessels were the ultimate status symbols for the galaxy's wealthiest and most powerful beings. His designs were revolutionary, incorporating innovative propulsion systems, elegant aesthetics, and cutting-edge technology. Among his most famous creations would later be the Scimitar, the Sith infiltrator that would eventually serve Darth Maul during the invasion of Naboo, though most of the galaxy knew this ship simply as a Wraith CNR design, unaware of its true origins. This public persona as gnome gave Tenebris exactly what he needed: access and influence without suspicion. Wealthy senators and corporate magnates would seek him out, sharing their problems and ambitions while he designed their personal transport vessels. These conversations provided Tenebris with intelligence about political alliances, corporate mergers, economic trends, and power dynamics throughout the galaxy. He cultivated relationships with beings who never suspected they were feeding information directly to a Dark Lord of the Sith. But as Darth Tenebris, he was something else entirely. He was a cold, calculating manipulator who viewed the Force through a scientific lens. Where other Sith Lords saw the dark side as a mystical power to be channeled through passion and rage, Tenebris saw patterns, formulas, probability matrices waiting to be solved. He approached Sith sorcery with the mindset of a research scientist, documenting his experiments, analyzing variables, seeking to understand the underlying mechanisms by which the Force operated. One of Tenebris's most ambitious projects involved attempting to create a virus that could sever a being's connection to the Force. His reasoning was both strategic and scientific. If the Sith could develop such a weapon, they could theoretically neutralize the entire Jedi Order without having to physically confront them. Tens of thousands of Jedi would suddenly find themselves cut off from the power that defined them, reduced to ordinary beings. With lightsabers, they no longer had the reflexes to wield effectively. Tenebris worked on this virus for years, Using his master of both Sith alchemy and Bith bioengineering to create various iterations, he tested each version on unwilling subjects, carefully documenting the results. But the project ultimately proved to be a failure, though an instructive one. Tenebris discovered that there was no way to target specifically the light side of the Force without also affecting the dark side. The Force, despite the clear distinction between light and dark that defined how it was used, was fundamentally unified at its deepest level. Any virus that could sever one being's connection would potentially sever all connections, including those of the Sith themselves. Moreover, midi-chlorians existed in all living beings to some degree, even those not strong enough in the Force to be considered Force-sensitive. A virus that attacked midi-chlorians indiscriminately would essentially become a plague that could devastate all life in the galaxy. While Tenebris was certainly ruthless enough to consider such an option, the practical problems of deployment and control made it unfeasible. The project was abandoned, but the research was carefully archived. Tenebris believed that while this particular approach had failed, the underlying principles might prove useful in other applications. Young Plagueis observed these experiments with fascination, though he was not yet allowed to participate directly. He watched his master work with test subjects, seen the Sith Lord's cold, detached methodology as he inflicted suffering in the name of scientific inquiry. These observations planted seeds that would later grow into Plagueis' own obsessive experiments with midi-chlorian manipulation, though his approach would differ significantly from his master's. What Plagueis didn't know during these early years was that Tenebris had violated one of the most fundamental principles of the Sith Order. Despite Darth Bane's rule of two, despite the clear doctrine that there should only ever be two Sith at any given time, Tenebris had secretly taken a second apprentice. This being another Bith named Darth Venomous, was trained in complete secrecy, kept hidden even from Plagueis. Tenebris's reasoning for this betrayal of Bane's rule was coldly pragmatic. He suspected that Plagueis might figure out his master's true plans and rebel before the time was right. Alternatively, Plagueis might prove unsuitable as a vessel for Tenebris's consciousness transfer. Having a backup apprentice ensured that the Dark Lord's plans could continue even if something went wrong with Plagueis. Venomous was trained in different techniques, given different missions, developed along parallel but separate lines from Plagueis. For his part, Plagueis chafed under his master's tutelage. The young moon was brilliant, and he recognized that Tenebris's training methods were holding him back. The missions he was sent on seemed beneath his capabilities, tests rather than true challenges. Tenebris refused to teach him certain advanced techniques, always offering excuses about Plagueis not being ready, needing more time to develop basic skills before moving on to master-level abilities. But Plagueis was not content to simply accept these limitations. When Tenebris sent him on missions alone, Plagueis would experiment with his abilities, pushing them further than his master had authorized. He developed his own understanding of how the Force worked, particularly in the manipulation of midi-chlorians. While Tenebris viewed this aspect of the Force as a means to an end for his consciousness transfer scheme, Plagueis began to see much broader possibilities. Midi-chlorians were the microscopic organisms that existed in all living cells and served as the bridge between living beings and the Force. Their concentration in a being's cells determined their potential strength in the Force. But what if they could be manipulated directly? What if a being skilled enough could command midi-chlorians to perform specific functions, to heal injuries, to extend life, perhaps even to create life where none had existed before? These were questions that fascinated young Plagueis far more than the dry calculations and probability matrices that obsessed his master. Tenebris saw the Force as something to be mapped and predicted. Plagueis began to see it as something to be commanded, bent to his will through understanding of its most fundamental biological component. As Plagueis grew in power and knowledge, he also grew in resentment of his master. He recognized that Tenebris was using him, though he didn't yet understand the full extent of the Bith's plans. He saw how other Sith Lords throughout history had been elevated by their masters, trained earnestly to become worthy successors. Even though the relationship always ended in betrayal, there was a certain dark honor to it, a recognition that the apprentice was being prepared to carry on the Sith legacy. But Tenebris seemed to have no interest in preparing Plagueis for true leadership. He kept his apprentice at arm's length, sharing knowledge sparingly, always maintaining absolute control over every aspect of their relationship. Plagueis began to suspect that his master feared him, feared what he might become if truly unleashed. This suspicion fed Plagueis' ambition. If Tenebris feared his potential, then perhaps that potential was even greater than Plagueis had imagined. 25 years into his apprenticeship, Plagueis received his first truly significant mission. Tenebris commanded him to assassinate Carad Santhe, a powerful industrialist whose agents had stolen ship designs from Rugus Gnome's workshop. The theft was not just a financial matter, it was a breach of security that could potentially reveal elements of Tenebris's more secretive work. The industrialist needed to be eliminated as a message to others, and to ensure the stolen information went no further. Plagueis approached this mission with methodical precision. He studied Santhe's security arrangements, identified vulnerabilities, and planned his approach carefully. When he struck, he did so with both physical violence and force abilities, using telekinesis to devastating effect. The assassination was successful, but it revealed something important to both master and apprentice. Plagueis had performed the killing with a certain flair, an emotional investment that Tenebris had hoped to suppress. The Bith master wanted his apprentice to be cold and calculating, to approach violence as a necessary tool applied with detached efficiency. But Plagueis couldn't completely suppress his emotional connection to the dark side. He drew power from his ambition, his resentment, his hunger for knowledge and dominance. This passion was what made him dangerous, what made him powerful, but it also made him unpredictable from Tenebris's perspective. The rift between them grew wider with each passing year. Plagueis learned to hide his true thoughts from his master, presenting a facade of obedience while internally planning for the day when he would break free. He knew the tradition of the Sith. He knew that every apprentice eventually killed their master. Tenebris knew it too. The question was not whether this would happen, but when, and whether Plagueis would have the strength and cunning to succeed when he made his attempt. That day would come during a mission to a remote mining world on a planet called Baldemnik, where cortosis ore lay waiting to be extracted, and where betrayal would flow as freely as the lethal gases trapped beneath the surface. The murder on Baldemnik. The year was 67 years before the Battle of Yavin, and Darth Tenebris had received intelligence about a significant cortosis deposit on the planet Baldemnik. Cortosis was one of the few materials in the galaxy that could short out a lightsaber blade, making it invaluable for creating weapons or armor that could stand against Jedi. For a Sith Lord planning the eventual destruction of the Jedi Order, access to cortosis represented a strategic advantage that couldn't be ignored. Tenebris arranged for a mining probe to be sent to Baldemnik to analyze the deposit and determine its exact size and purity. He brought Plagueis along, ostensibly to oversee the technical aspects of the survey. In truth, Tenebris remained wary of leaving his apprentice alone for extended periods. Despite his manipulations and control mechanisms, the Sith Lord was beginning to sense that Plagueis was growing more dangerous, more unpredictable. Taking him along ensured he remained under direct supervision. Baldemnik itself was an inhospitable world, characterized by hostile locals and unstable geological formations. The planet's crust was riddled with pockets of compressed gases, many of them highly flammable or toxic. Mining operations had to be conducted with extreme caution, as even small disturbances could trigger catastrophic explosions or release deadly compounds into the atmosphere. It was exactly the sort of dangerous environment where accidents could happen, where even powerful Force users might be caught off guard by sudden disaster. What neither Tenebris nor Plagueis fully realized was that Rouget's Gnome had business competitors who were growing increasingly frustrated with his monopoly on certain high-end starship designs. These rivals had learned about the cortosis survey and saw an opportunity to eliminate Gnome permanently. They couldn't attack him directly without risking exposure and legal consequences, but an industrial accident on a remote mining world could be arranged with minimal risk. These competitors had infiltrated Gnome's operation, specifically targeting the probe droid that had been sent to survey the cortosis deposits. They sabotaged its core functions, installing programming that would cause it to trigger an explosion at a specific point in the survey process. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Gnome and whoever he brought with him would be vaporized in a massive explosion of flammable gas, with no evidence of foul play beyond a tragic equipment malfunction. Tenebris and Plagueis descended into the depths of Baldemnik, following the probe droid as it navigated through narrow caverns toward the richest concentration of cortosis. The Force was oddly resonant in these deep places, almost as if the planet itself was aware of their presence. Plagueis felt something building, a tension in the Force that he recognized as precognitive warning, though he couldn't quite identify the specific danger. Tenebris, despite his vaunted ability to calculate and predict, was too focused on the survey results to sense the immediate threat. His attention was divided between the technical readouts and his constant monitoring of his apprentice's emotional state. This distraction would prove fatal. The probe droid reached a critical juncture, a cavern where multiple gas pockets converged beneath a relatively thin layer of rock. As programmed by the saboteurs, the droid system suddenly overloaded, creating a massive spark that ignited the compressed gases. The explosion was instantaneous and devastating, a bloom of fire and force that tore through the cavern system like the wrath of an ancient god. Tenebrous reacted with the trained instincts of a Sith Lord who had survived for over a century. He reached out with the Force, creating a barrier that contained the explosion and prevented it from consuming them both immediately. At the same time, he began using the Force to expel the gases, channeling them out through fissures in the rock rather than allowing them to continue burning in the enclosed space. It was a display of power and control that few Force users could have matched, a testament to why Darth Tenebrous had maintained his position as Dark Lord for so long. But Plagueis saw something else in that moment. He saw his master fully extended, channeling so much of his power into containing the disaster that he had nothing left for defense. He saw the cavern ceiling fracturing under the stress of the explosion and Tenebrous's Force manipulation. And he saw his opportunity. For decades, Plagueis had waited for this moment, imagining how it would feel to finally break free of his master's control. He had planned various scenarios, different approaches he might take when the time came, but when the moment arrived, there was no hesitation, no second guessing. His actions flowed with a clarity born of absolute certainty. Plagueis reached out with the Force, but instead of helping his master contain the explosion, he did the opposite. He grabbed hold of the fractured sections of the ceiling and accelerated their collapse. Massive slabs of rock, each weighing tons, plummeted toward Darth Tenebrous. One particularly large stalactite, as thick as a tree trunk and sharp as a spear, fell directly toward the Bith's position. Tenebrous realized what was happening a split second before the stone struck him. In that infinitesimal moment, the Sith Lord understood that he had been betrayed, that all his calculations and predictions had been for nothing, that his apprentice had outmaneuvered him at the critical instant. There might have been rage or fear or even a cold appreciation for Plagueis' tactical timing. But there was no time to react. The stalactite impaled Tenebrous through the torso, pinning him to the ground even as other debris rained down around them. The Bith's breathing became labored, blood pooled around his ruined body. He was dying, but not instantly. Tenebrous was too powerful in the Force, too resilient to die immediately even from such catastrophic injuries. He had minutes, perhaps, before his life would end. Plagueis approached his dying master with deliberate slowness, allowing the moment to resonate. He could sense Tenebrous's midi-chlorians beginning to fail, the microscopic organisms that had served as the bridge between the Bith's consciousness and the Force starting to die as their host body shut down. It was a process he watched with intense fascination, cataloging every nuance for future reference. Tenebrous managed to speak, his voice a wet rasp, barely audible over the settling debris. To Plagueis' surprise, his master was not pleading or threatening. Instead, Tenebrous congratulated him. "Perhaps I was wrong to think you had no stomach for it," the dying Sith wheezed. There was dark approval in those words, a recognition that Plagueis had finally demonstrated the ruthlessness required of a true Sith Lord. But Plagueis had no interest in his master's approval anymore. He had moved beyond needing Tenebrous's validation. Instead, he wanted to make a statement, to declare that everything Tenebrous represented was finished. The young moon leaned close to his dying master and spoke with cold finality. "Yes, master, Your death comes at my bidding. You said yourself that perpetuation with purpose is the way to victory, and so it is. Go to your grave knowing that you are last of the old order, the vaunted rule of two, and that the new order begins now and will for 1,000 years remain in my control. These words were more than just a declaration of victory. They were a manifesto, a rejection of Darth Bane's philosophy and everything it represented. Plagueis had no intention of eventually dying at his apprentice's hand. He had no desire to be merely another link in an endless chain of betrayal and succession. He envisioned something grander, an order where he would rule forever, having conquered death itself, with an apprentice who served not as an eventual replacement, but as a junior partner in eternal dominion. Tenebrous' eyes widened at these words, understanding finally dawning about just how thoroughly his apprentice intended to break with tradition. But he had no strength left to respond. Plagueis, showing neither mercy nor hesitation, used the force to snap his master's neck, ensuring death came swiftly. He then remained crouched beside the body, continuing to observe the slow death of Tenebrous' midichlorians, watching as the force itself gradually withdrew from cells that could no longer sustain it. What Plagueis didn't know, couldn't have detected even with his keen interest in midichlorian manipulation, was that Tenebrous had prepared one final gambit. The retrovirus the Bith had created, his maxichlorians, had successfully infected his own midichlorians. At the moment of death, these altered organisms attempted their programmed function. They tried to transfer Tenebrous' consciousness into Plagueis' body. For a brief, terrifying moment, Tenebrous' awareness flooded into his apprentice. He gained access to Plagueis' power of foresight, the ability to see possible futures. And what he saw horrified him. He witnessed Plagueis' own death, murdered by his apprentice far sooner than the chosen one would appear. He understood that his grand plan had failed completely. The consciousness transfer itself was flawed, unable to fully take hold. Tenebrous found himself trapped in a loop, reliving his death over and over, unable to move forward or escape, his essence scattered among corrupted midichlorians that had lost their connection to the living force. But Plagueis was unaware of this spectral prison his master now inhabited. He only knew that Darth Tenebrous was dead, and that he, Plagueis, was now the reigning Dark Lord of the Sith. He left his master's body where it lay, buried under tons of rock, and made his way out of the caverns alone. The ship they had arrived in had been destroyed in the explosion, another part of the sabotage that had triggered this entire sequence of events. Plagueis commandeered a nearby vessel called the Woebegone, a transport that belonged to smugglers who had been operating illegally on Baldemnik. These smugglers and their crew learned too late that they had encountered something far more dangerous than local authorities. Plagueis killed them all without remorse, viewing them as loose ends that needed to be eliminated. He could have simply stolen the ship and left them stranded, but there was a principle at stake. He was announcing to the galaxy, though none would hear it yet, that the era of Darth Plagueis had begun, and in this new era, obstacles were not bypassed, but obliterated. Among the possessions he claimed from the Woebegone was a multi-limbed droid, designated 11-4D. This droid would become Plagueis' constant companion and assistant for the remainder of his life, a mechanical servant completely loyal and utterly discreet, capable of performing delicate medical procedures and scientific experiments with precision that matched or exceeded organic assistance. In the decades to come, 11 to 4D would witness horrors that would drive most sentient beings to madness, but as a droid, it simply recorded and assisted, carrying out its master's commands without judgment or hesitation. Plagueis piloted the Wobegon away from Baldemnik, with the ship's holds full of cortosis ore and his mind racing with possibilities. He was free. The oppressive weight of Tenebrus's control had been lifted. Now he could pursue knowledge without restriction, could experiment without his master limiting his access to resources or questioning his methods. The galaxy was his laboratory, and he had centuries of Sith wisdom combined with his own brilliant mind to guide his exploration of the Force's darkest secrets. But first, he had to deal with a problem he didn't yet know existed: Darth Venomous, the secret second apprentice who would soon learn of Tenebrus's death and assume that the position of Dark Lord was his for the taking. The venomous problem and the hunt for power upon returning to civilized space, Plagueis made his way to Sojourn, a moon that housed one of the Sith's most valuable assets, the Gatherings. These were annual events hosted under the public identity of Higo Damask, heir to his father's banking fortune and now controller of Damask Holdings. The gatherings brought together politicians, corporate leaders, crime lords, and influential beings from across the galaxy for what appeared to be elite networking events. In reality, they were tools of Sith influence, opportunities to manipulate, bribe, and corrupt the galaxy's power brokers while they thought they were simply attending an exclusive social function. Plagueis had inherited these gatherings from his father, who had used them primarily as a means of maintaining social status and business connections. Under Tenebrus's guidance, Plagueis had transformed them into something far more insidious. Now, with Tenebrus gone, he planned to expand their reach even further, turning them into one of the primary instruments through which the Sith would corrupt and control galactic affairs. But when Plagueis arrived at his compound on Sojourn, he discovered an intruder. Another Force-sensitive being had penetrated his security, someone skilled enough to avoid detection by the conventional systems while also concealing their presence in the Force from casual observation. Plagueis's newly honed instincts warned him that this was no ordinary threat. The intruder revealed himself as Darth Venomous, another Bith, and the being's first words confirmed what Plagueis had already begun to suspect. Venomous claimed to be the rightful heir to Darth Tenebrus, the true chosen apprentice, and he demanded that Plagueis submit to his authority as the new Dark Lord of the Sith. The revelation that Tenebrus had trained a second apprentice stunned Plagueis, though he was careful not to let this show. His mind raced through the implications. Tenebrus had violated the rule of two that he claimed to revere. The Bith had hedged his bets, preparing a backup apprentice in case Plagueis proved unsuitable. This betrayal, even by the treacherous standards of the Sith, represented a profound contempt for the traditions of their order. But the shock lasted only moments. Venomous clearly expected Plagueis to be unprepared, perhaps even intimidated by this revelation. Instead, Plagueis felt only cold anger and a predatory focus. If Tenebrus had considered Venomous worthy of being an alternative heir, then the Bith must have received substantial training. This made him dangerous, but it also made him valuable. Plagueis' mind, always working on multiple levels simultaneously, saw opportunities beyond the immediate confrontation. Venomous attacked, demonstrating impressive command of Sith techniques. He wielded a lightsaber with the skill of someone who had trained for decades, and his command of the Force was substantial. The two Sith clashed in the compound, their blades weaving patterns of crimson light, the air crackling with dark side energy as each sought to gain advantage over the other. At first, Plagueis struggled against his unexpected opponent. Venomous had been trained differently, with techniques that caught the moon off guard. But gradually, Plagueis' superior power began to tell. His connection to the Force was simply stronger, his midi-chlorian count higher, his potential greater. Moreover, he fought with absolute conviction, while Venomous harbored doubts about whether he could actually defeat the moon, who had killed their shared master. The duel ended with Plagueis disarming Venomous, literally and figuratively, using both his own lightsaber and the one he tore from his opponent's grasp. Plagueis forced the Bith to his knees. Venomous, recognizing defeat, attempted to salvage the situation by offering to become Plagueis' apprentice. It was a logical proposition. From Venomous's perspective, he was skilled, knowledgeable, and shared the same species as their late master, suggesting potential genetic advantages. But Plagueis had other plans. Instead of accepting Venomous's offer or simply killing him outright, Plagueis employed a technique of exquisite cruelty. He used the Force to compel Venomous to consume a coma bloom, a plant whose toxins would put the Bith into a deep, death-like state. Venomous's conscious mind would be trapped, aware but unable to act, while his body remained technically alive. Plagueis had Venomous's comatose form transported to Abora, a world in the Tingle Arm, and placed in a Bacta tank in a secret facility. There, over the course of years, Plagueis would conduct experiments that would have been considered abominations even by the relaxed moral standards of Sith alchemy. He killed Venomous and brought him back to life over and over again, testing the limits of midi-chlorian manipulation, exploring how consciousness related to the Force, and developing techniques that would form the foundation for his later work on immortality. But before diving fully into these experiments, Plagueis had another problem to address. Through interrogation techniques applied before the coma bloom took full effect, Plagueis learned that Venomous had been planning ahead. Like any good Sith, he had identified several Force-sensitive beings across the galaxy as potential apprentices, candidates he could train once he assumed the mantle of Dark Lord. These beings were powerful, dangerous, and now completely unaware that their would-be master was locked in eternal torment in a secret laboratory. Plagueis set out to eliminate these potential rivals, tracking them one by one across the galaxy. Among them was a Nautolan Force-sensitive named Nat Lair, who had been institutionalized in a sanatorium on Bedlam after using his powers in ways that terrified ordinary citizens. Through careful investigation, Plagueis learned that Lair had recently escaped with the help of someone claiming to be a psychologist. Plagueis recognized this as Venomous in disguise, though the Bith was now safely imprisoned in Plagueis' facility. The escape must have occurred before Venomous's confrontation with Plagueis, meaning Lair was still out there, unaware that his benefactor was no longer in a position to fulfill his promises. The hunt led Plagueis to Abraxan, where Lair had killed dozens of beings in a rampage fueled by dark side rage and poor control of his abilities. Jedi Master Nikata and his Padawan, Lo Buck, were investigating the murders when Plagueis arrived. The moon carefully concealed his Force abilities, presenting himself as Hago Damask, a concerned citizen who happened to be on-world for business purposes. When Plagueis finally confronted Lair, he identified himself as a Sith Master and offered the Nautolan the chance that Venomous had promised, apprenticeship under a Dark Lord. But Plagueis set a test. If Lara could eliminate the investigating Jedi, he would prove himself worthy of training. If he failed, he would die. The contest was brutally short. Lair attacked with wild abandon, channeling years of rage and frustration into his assault on the Jedi. But Master Nikata had decades of experience and training that the undisciplined Force-sensitive lacked. Within moments, Lair lay dead, his potential wasted through lack of proper instruction. Plagueis watched from concealment, analyzing the confrontation and confirming what he had already suspected. Raw power meant nothing without training, discipline, and strategic thinking. Plagueis systematically hunted down and eliminated the rest of Venomous's prospects. Some he killed directly when they proved too dangerous or unstable. Others he arranged to have killed by authorities or rival criminals, ensuring that no loose ends remained. Each elimination was both a security measure and a learning experience, as Plagueis observed how differently individuals with Force potential manifested their powers when untrained or poorly trained. With these threats neutralized, Plagueis finally turned his full attention to his new life as Dark Lord of the Sith. He had resources at his disposal that few Sith before him had enjoyed. Damask Holdings gave him access to galactic-scale finances and economic influence. The gatherings on Sojourn provided him with a network of corrupt officials, greedy corporate executives, and ambitious crime lords, and his inherited position in the intergalactic banking clan opened doors throughout the galaxy's most powerful institutions. But more than resources, Plagueis had vision. He could see how the pieces fit together, how economic pressure here could lead to political instability there, how corporate mergers could shift the balance of power in the Senate, how criminal operations could be leveraged to destabilize systems and create crises that the Republic would struggle to address. He began to implement a long-term strategy, one that would gradually undermine the foundations of the Republic while simultaneously positioning the Sith to seize power when the moment came. Yet despite all this power and influence, despite the freedom to pursue his goals without Tenebris's interference, Plagueis found himself increasingly fixated on a single question. What if the rule of two itself was obsolete? What if there was a way to rule forever, to accumulate knowledge and power across centuries without ever having to pass the mantle to an apprentice who would inevitably betray him? This question would drive him to experiments of unprecedented audacity, to explorations of the Force that would change the nature of the Sith forever, and ultimately to discoveries that would tempt even the most disciplined Jedi Knight toward darkness. But first, he needed to find an apprentice, someone who could serve as more than just an eventual successor, someone who could become a partner in his grand vision of eternal Sith dominion. That someone was waiting on Naboo, a young man from a noble family with ambitions as vast as the galaxy itself and a darkness in his soul that rivaled any Sith Lord who had come before. His name was Sheev Palpatine. The discovery of Palpatine. The planet Naboo was a world of beauty and tragedy, of gleaming cities and verdant plains, of an idealistic society that valued art and peace, while sitting atop vast reserves of plasma energy that made it strategically and economically vital. In 65 years before the Battle of Yavin, Naboo was entering a period of political transition as the elderly King Tapalo prepared to assume the throne following the resignation of the previous monarch. Plagueis had been monitoring Naboo for some time, his interest piqued by the discovery of a massive plasma reserve that dwarfed previous estimates of the planet's energy resources. Under his identity as Higo Damask, he had arranged for Damask Holdings to construct a plasma refinery complex on Naboo, ostensibly as a business venture, but in reality as a means of establishing Sith influence on a world that would later prove crucial to the grand plan. When Plagueis traveled to Naboo to personally oversee the refinery construction and assess the political situation, he was approached by an intermediary representing pro-Tapalo forces. This intermediary mentioned a young man from a noble family who had been instrumental in ensuring certain votes would go Tapalo's way, someone who had demonstrated remarkable political acumen despite his youth. The intermediary suggested that this young man, Sheev Palpatine, might be useful to Damask's operations on Naboo. Plagueis agreed to meet this Palpatine, curious about anyone who had already demonstrated skills in manipulation and political maneuvering. The young man who presented himself at Damask's residence was 19 years old, with aristocratic features, keen intelligence visible in his eyes, and a bearing that suggested someone accustomed to privilege yet chafing under its restrictions. On the surface, Sheev Palpatine appeared to be simply another ambitious noble's son seeking to make his mark on the galaxy. But Plagueis, with decades of experience in reading beings and sensing their true natures through the Force, detected something far more interesting. Beneath Palpatine's polished exterior lurked a darkness that took the Sith Lord's breath away. This was not merely the casual cruelty of spoiled nobility or the ruthless ambition of someone seeking wealth and status. This was a profound, almost pathological desire for power, control, and domination. It was a hunger that could never be satisfied, an emptiness that would consume everything in its path. More than that, Plagueis sensed Force sensitivity in the young man. It was not immediately obvious, not the kind of power that manifested in telekinetic outbursts or empathic flashes. Palpatine's connection to the Force was subtle but remarkably strong. Like a river running deep underground, its power masked by layers of careful control and lifetime of unconscious suppression. Their first conversation revealed even more. Palpatine spoke about his father, Kosinga Palpatine, with barely concealed hatred. Kosinga was a man who valued tradition and propriety above all else, who had tried to mold his son into a perfect noble heir without any regard for the boy's own desires or nature. Sheev described his family as a prison, their estate as a cage, their expectations as chains that had bound him his entire life. He wanted to break free, wanted to prove himself superior to the small-minded aristocrats who thought birth and breeding mattered more than will and ambition. Plagueis recognized in that moment that he had found something extraordinary. Palpatine was not just Force-sensitive, he was not just ambitious, he was perfect. His deep-seated resentment toward his family and their values would make him receptive to Sith teachings. His natural cunning and political instincts would serve the grand plan well, and his Force potential, while not immediately obvious to others, was among the highest Plagueis had ever encountered. With proper training, this young man could become one of the most powerful Sith Lords in history. But Plagueis understood that recruiting Palpatine would require a different approach than he had used with other potential followers. This young man was proud, intelligent, and suspicious. Simply offering him power or knowledge would not be enough. Palpatine needed to feel that he was making the choice himself, that he was taking control of his own destiny rather than submitting to another's will. So Plagueis planted seeds, asking careful questions about Palpatine's ambitions, his frustrations, his vision for his own future. He presented himself not as a master seeking an apprentice, but as a mentor who saw potential that others had overlooked. He suggested subtly that there might be ways to achieve things that conventional society said were impossible, that there were powers in the galaxy that transcended the limited abilities of ordinary beings. Palpatine proved to be an attentive listener and a quick study. He asked probing questions that demonstrated both his intelligence and his willingness to consider paths that others would reject as immoral or dangerous. When Plagueis carefully introduced the concept of the Force as something that could be mastered and controlled rather than simply served, Palpatine's interest intensified. The turning point came during the confrontation between Palpatine and his father. Plagueis had been subtly stoking the young man's resentment, encouraging him to see his family not as a source of support, but as obstacles to his true potential. When Kosinga Palpatine humiliated his son publicly at a family gathering, dismissing his political accomplishments as trivial games, and demanding that Sheev focus on proper noble responsibilities, something snapped in the young man's carefully maintained control. That night, Palpatine returned to the family estate in a rage. His father was waiting, prepared to deliver another lecture about duty and propriety, but instead of submitting, as he had countless times before, Palpatine let his anger flow freely for the first time in his life. And in that moment of absolute fury, he unconsciously reached out with the Force. What followed was a massacre that shocked even Plagueis when he learned the details. Palpatine killed his entire family, his father, his mother, his siblings. He tore through the estate like a dark storm, channeling Force power he didn't consciously know he possessed, driven by years of accumulated hatred and resentment, finally given expression. When the bloodlust finally subsided, Palpatine stood alone in his family home, surrounded by death, and felt not horror or guilt, but liberation. Plagueis arrived shortly after, having sensed the massive disturbance in the Force. He found Palpatine in a state of exhilarated shock, simultaneously horrified by what he had done and thrilled by the power he had discovered within himself. The young man looked at the mask with new understanding, recognizing that the older moon had known all along what he was capable of, had been deliberately guiding him toward this moment. "Who are you?" Palpatine asked, though he already suspected the answer. Plagueis revealed his true nature, explaining the existence of the Sith, their philosophy, their power, and their plans for the galaxy. He told Palpatine about the Force and how it could be controlled and manipulated. He offered the young man a choice. Palpatine could try to hide what he had done, attempt to return to his former life, and spend his days wondering what he might have become. Or he could embrace his nature, accept training in the dark side, and become something far greater than any noble heir could ever dream of being. Palpatine's choice was never in doubt. He swore himself to Plagueis, accepting the name Darth Sidious, and beginning an apprenticeship that would reshape galactic history. Together, they arranged for the Palpatine estate to burn, destroying evidence of the massacre and allowing Sheev to publicly claim that his entire family had died in a tragic accident. The local authorities, many of whom had been at the gatherings and were already susceptible to Damask's influence, asked few probing questions. The relationship between Plagueis and Sidious would prove to be unlike any other in Sith history. Plagueis did not treat Sidious as merely an apprentice to be used and eventually replaced. Instead, he sought to create something new, a genuine partnership where master and apprentice would work together toward mutual goals, with each compensating for the other's weaknesses and amplifying the other's strengths. Plagueis focused on the scientific and economic aspects of their plans, manipulating markets and conducting experiments to unlock the secrets of immortality. Sidious, meanwhile, would become their political weapon, rising through the ranks of the Galactic Senate and positioning himself to seize power when the moment came. Together, they would overthrow the Republic, destroy the Jedi, and rule the galaxy for 10,000 years. It was an ambitious plan, one that broke with centuries of Sith tradition, and like all plans that depend on trust between Sith Lords, it carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. But in those early days, neither master nor apprentice could see the betrayal that would eventually come. They were too focused on the enemy before them and the power they believed they would soon wield together. The decades of partnership. The years following Palpatine's initiation into the Sith Order were marked by extraordinary transformation for both master and apprentice. Plagueis poured his knowledge into Sidious with an intensity that bordered on obsession, determined to create an apprentice who was not just powerful, but perfectly suited to the role he would eventually play in the grand plan. Unlike Tenebrous, who had deliberately held Plagueis back, Plagueis genuinely wanted Sidious to become as strong as possible, believing that their combined power would allow them to rule together, rather than fall into the traditional pattern of betrayal and succession. Sidious proved to be an extraordinary student. His connection to the Force was stronger than Plagueis had initially realized, and his capacity for learning seemed limitless. Where other apprentices might have taken decades to master certain techniques, Sidious absorbed teachings with frightening speed. More importantly, he had an intuitive understanding of how to apply Force powers in practical situations. He could look at a political gathering and instantly see the patterns of influence and leverage, understanding how to manipulate events with subtle applications of Force suggestion or more direct techniques when necessary. Plagueis taught Sidious the fundamentals of Sith philosophy, the rejection of restraint, the embrace of passion as a source of power, the understanding that the strong had not just a right, but an obligation to dominate the weak. But he also taught him patience, the most difficult lesson for any Sith. The apprentice learned that true power came not from dramatic displays, but from methodical manipulation over extended periods. Together, master and apprentice conducted experiments that pushed the boundaries of what Force users had previously believed possible. Plagueis' primary obsession remained a conquest of death itself. He believed that by manipulating midi-chlorians at a fundamental level, he could prevent the natural decay that eventually claimed all living beings. These experiments required test subjects, and Darth Venomous served as the primary specimen for the most invasive procedures. Plagueis would kill Venomous, allowing the Bith's body to undergo the process of death, then use the Force to command his midi-chlorians to resume their functions, essentially resurrecting the subject. Each resurrection provided data about how midi-chlorians responded to death, how consciousness related to biological function, and where the boundaries lay between life and death. After dozens of cycles, Venomous's organs finally gave out, unable to sustain the trauma of repeated death and resurrection. Plagueis granted him everlasting death, a permanent end to suffering that, in some twisted way, might have been considered mercy. The knowledge gained from these experiments was both profound and disturbing. Plagueis discovered that he could indeed manipulate midi-chlorians to extend life and heal injuries that would normally be fatal. He could even create life in certain circumstances, inducing midi-chlorians to trigger cell division and embryonic development in organisms that would not have naturally conceived. This power, the ability to create life itself, represented a fundamental breaking of natural law, and Plagueis felt the Force itself seemed to resist his efforts. Sidious participated in many of these experiments, learning the techniques and theories that his master had developed. He observed with clinical interest as Plagueis pushed the boundaries of what had previously been considered impossible. But the apprentice also began to form his own theories about why Plagueis' quest for immortality faced such difficulties. Plagueis believed he was close to achieving true immortality, to creating a state where his body would simply not age or decay, maintained indefinitely by midi-chlorians under his conscious control. But Sidious suspected that his master was approaching the problem incorrectly. The midi-chlorian manipulation was certainly powerful, but it required constant focus and effort. The moment Plagueis let his guard down or his concentration slipped, the natural order would reassert itself. There was, however, another approach to immortality that ancient Sith had developed: consciousness transference. This technique allowed a Sith Lord to abandon their dying body and transfer their awareness into a new vessel. The process was difficult and dangerous, often resulting in the consciousness being scattered or the new body rejecting the invading presence. But theoretically, a Sith who mastered this technique could live forever, simply moving from body to body as each one wore out. Plagueis knew of this technique, but dismissed it as an inferior solution. He wanted to preserve his original form, not hop between borrowed bodies like some parasitic spirit. His pride would not allow him to accept a solution that required surrendering his identity, even temporarily. This stubborn insistence on one particular path to immortality would ultimately prove to be his greatest weakness. While Plagueis focused on his scientific pursuits, Sidious began building the political infrastructure that would eventually allow him to seize control of the Republic. At Plagueis' arrangement, Sidious was elected Senator of Naboo and the Shomel sector in 52 years before the Battle of Yavin. The election was not entirely fair. Damask Holdings had ensured that certain opponents withdrew or suffered unfortunate scandals, but neither was it obviously corrupt. Sidious presented himself as a reformer, someone who understood that the Republic needed fresh perspectives and stronger leadership to address growing problems. As a senator, Sidious was patient and methodical. He did not immediately push for radical changes or draw attention to himself. Instead, he spent years building relationships, learning the formal and informal power structures of the Senate, identifying which senators could be bribed, which could be blackmailed, and which were too principled to be corrupted but could be manipulated through their idealism. During this time, Plagueis attempted something extraordinarily ambitious, creating a Force dyad with Sidious. The concept of a Force dyad had been theorized by ancient Sith but never successfully achieved. Two beings linked through the Force so strongly that they functioned as a single entity, sharing power and awareness across any distance. Such a connection would represent the ultimate expression of Plagueis' vision for a master and apprentice working in perfect cooperation. But the attempt failed. Despite their shared goals and apparent trust, something fundamental prevented the dyad from forming. Perhaps it was that neither truly surrendered their individual will to become part of something greater. Perhaps the very nature of the Sith, with their emphasis on individual power and domination, made such a connection impossible. Whatever the reason, Plagueis and Sidious remained separate beings, powerful but ultimately alone in the Force. This failure troubled Plagueis more than he let on. He had believed that the dyad represented the next evolution of the Sith, a way to transcend the limitations of the rule of two while maintaining its power-concentrating benefits. The fact that they couldn't achieve it suggested that perhaps the old rules held more wisdom than he had believed. Throughout these years, they also began implementing more concrete aspects of the grand plan. They manipulated the Trade Federation, a massive commercial organization with its own defense fleet, into becoming increasingly aggressive in protecting its interests. They encouraged corruption within the Republic Senate, ensuring that legitimate attempts at reform were blocked or watered down until they became meaningless. They funded separatist movements on various worlds, creating low-level instability that would eventually provide the pretext for more dramatic action. One of their most significant operations involved the Yinchori species. Plagueis arranged for a conflict between the Yinchori and the Republic that would serve multiple purposes. It would test the Jedi Order's response to coordinated military action, provide intelligence about current Jedi combat doctrine and capabilities, and create a crisis that would make various senators more receptive to the idea that the Republic needed a stronger military. During this period, Plagueis also maintained his public identity with meticulous care. As Hago Damask, he continued to host the gatherings on Sojourn, using these events to corrupt officials and business leaders from across the galaxy. He expanded Damask Holdings' reach, acquiring control or significant influence over dozens of corporations. He made strategic investments that positioned him to profit immensely from the chaos he and Sidious were creating. By any conventional measure, Hago Damask was one of the wealthiest and most influential beings in the galaxy, someone who moved in the highest circles while arousing no suspicion about his true nature. But success brought its own dangers. At one of the gatherings, Plagueis was attacked by assassins hired by Senator Pack's team. a grand politician who had lost a key vote due to Sidious's influence and blamed Damask for the interference. The assassins were skilled and well-armed, and they came close to achieving their goal. Plagueis survived the attack, but he was grievously injured. The lower portion of his face was destroyed, his respiratory system so damaged that he would require a transpirator mask to breathe for the rest of his life. It was a permanent reminder of mortality, of vulnerability, a constant physical presence that mocked his quest for immortality. The mask became part of his public appearance as Damask, explained away as the result of an industrial accident, but every breath he drew through the mechanical filter reminded him that even Sith Lords were not invincible. The attack had another, more subtle effect. Plagueis became paranoid about sleep. His experiments had taught him that the moment of transition into unconsciousness represented a period of vulnerability, when the mind's control over the body loosened and the midi-chlorians could potentially fail in their instructions to maintain and repair tissue. After the assassination attempt, Plagueis made a radical decision. He would never sleep again. Using a combination of force techniques and stimulants, Plagueis kept himself in a state of constant wakefulness. His body would rest, entering a meditative trance that provided physical restoration, but his mind remained alert, maintaining vigilance against any threat. It was an exhausting way to exist, requiring tremendous willpower and concentration. But Plagueis convinced himself it was necessary. He could not be killed in his sleep if he never truly slept. This decision, born of paranoia and traumatic injury, would ultimately prove crucial to his downfall. But in the moment, it seemed like wisdom, like one more way that Darth Plagueis the Wise had outmaneuvered the enemies who sought his destruction. As the years passed and Sidious grew more powerful and politically sophisticated, their partnership appeared to be approaching its ultimate triumph. They were on the verge of implementing the final stages of the grand plan, the creation of a clone army that would serve as the Republic's military force while actually answering to Sith control, the triggering of a massive crisis that would grant emergency powers to a sympathetic chancellor, the positioning of that chancellor to declare himself emperor and destroy the Jedi Order in a single swift action. Everything was falling into place. Plagueis believed they had decades of preparation still ahead of them, time to refine their plans and ensure every detail was perfect. He had no way of knowing that his apprentice had already made his own calculations, that Sidious had decided the time was approaching when a master would no longer be necessary, when the apprentice could claim the power he believed was his by right. The betrayal, when it came, would be as perfect in its execution as anything the Sith had ever accomplished. The final night. The year was 32 before the Battle of Yavin. After decades of planning, manipulation, and patient preparation, the grand plan had reached a critical juncture. Sheev Palpatine, public face of Darth Sidious, had just been elected Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Republic. It was a triumph of political maneuvering, the culmination of years spent building alliances, making promises, and engineering the downfall of his predecessor, Finis Valorum. The election had been far from certain. It required the Trade Federation to blockade Naboo, creating a crisis that made Valorum appear weak and indecisive. It required Padme Amidala, the young queen of Naboo, to call for a vote of no confidence in the Chancellor. It required dozens of senators to vote for Palpatine, many of them influenced by credits that flowed through Damask holdings, others moved by forced suggestions they didn't recognize as external manipulation. Plagueis watched the Senate proceedings from a private location, using holographic transmissions to observe as his apprentice achieved what no Sith had accomplished in 1,000 years, openly becoming the head of the Republic government, all while the Jedi remained completely oblivious to his true nature. It was intoxicating, this victory, this confirmation that their decades of work had not been in vain. That night, Plagueis attended a celebration at the Galaxy's Opera House on Coruscant. He went under his public identity as Higo Damask, one of many wealthy and influential beings, congratulating the new Chancellor on his election. Sidious was there as well, playing the part of the humble public servant, graciously accepting the congratulations of beings who had no idea they were celebrating the first step in their own subjugation. Throughout the evening, Plagueis drank heavily, something he rarely did. The alcohol was a poor substitute for actual sleep, but it provided a kind of relaxation, a lowering of his constant vigilance. He had earned this moment of celebration. After suffering the indignity of the transpirator mask, after decades of paranoid wakefulness, after centuries of Sith operating in shadows, he was finally witnessing the beginning of their ascension. Sidious, ever attentive, ensured his master's glass was never empty. He matched Plagueis drink for drink, though the apprentice had subtle techniques for metabolizing alcohol more quickly, maintaining clarity while appearing to share in the intoxication. Throughout the evening, Sidious maneuvered them away from crowds, finding quiet corners where they could discuss plans for the immediate future. They talked about the next steps. Palpatine would consolidate his power as Chancellor, gradually accumulating authority that no Supreme Chancellor had held before. Damask would be appointed co-chancellor, allowing Plagueis to rule alongside his apprentice from behind the scenes. Together, they would begin restructuring the Republic, preparing it for eventual transformation into an empire with the Sith openly at its head. At least, that was what Plagueis believed they were discussing. But Sidious had already decided on a different path, one that would follow the ancient Sith tradition more closely than his master suspected. As the evening grew late, Sidious suggested they return to Plagueis' apartment on Coruscant. The new Chancellor wanted to discuss some delicate matters privately, away from even the minimal surveillance at the Opera House. Plagueis agreed readily, too intoxicated and too filled with a sense of triumph to suspect anything amiss. At the apartment, they continued drinking and talking. Sidious brought up various topics, each designed to keep his master engaged and distracted. He asked about future experiments with midi-chlorian manipulation, expressed interest in Plagueis' theories about achieving true immortality, discussed which senators would need to be pressured or eliminated in the coming months. Plagueis, his speech slightly slurred from alcohol and his attention wandering, settled into his meditation chair. This was how he slept now, entering a state of deep trance while his conscious mind maintained minimal awareness, enough to detect any threat. But tonight, saturated with alcohol and emotionally exhausted from the triumph and celebration, his trance went deeper than usual. The moment Sidious had been waiting for had arrived. For years, he had been studying his master, learning every technique and secret that Plagueis was willing to teach, and subtly extracting information about things his master thought he was keeping hidden. Sidious had come to understand that Plagueis' greatest weakness was not his quest for immortality, not his attachment to his original body, not even his naive belief that he and his apprentice could rule together as partners. No, Plagueis' greatest weakness was trust. Despite all his power and wisdom, despite his understanding of Sith history and the inevitable betrayal that characterized every master-apprentice relationship, Plagueis genuinely believed that he had created something different with Sidious. He believed that their shared vision, their mutual respect, their complementary skills would allow them to transcend the traditional cycle of betrayal. It was this trust that had let him lower his guard, that had let him drink too much, that had let him enter his trance in the presence of his apprentice without maintaining full defensive awareness. Sidious rose from his seat, moving with the careful grace of a predator who has finally cornered his prey. He looked at his master, slumped in the meditation chair, the transpirator making a soft, mechanical sounds as it assisted his breathing. For a moment, Sidious reflected on what he was about to do. Plagueis had taught him everything he knew about the Force. His master had genuinely cared for him in the twisted way that Sith Lords were capable of caring. Under other circumstances, perhaps they could have ruled together as Plagueis imagined. But Sidious had learned well the lesson at the heart of Sith philosophy. There can only be one master, one who holds ultimate power, and anyone who stands between a Sith and total domination must be eliminated, no matter how valuable they might seem. Moreover, Sidious had realized something that Plagueis had not fully grasped. The Chosen One, the being prophesied to bring balance to the Force, had recently been discovered on Tatooine. The Jedi had detected a young boy named Anakin Skywalker with a midichlorian count higher than any in recorded history, higher even than Master Yoda himself. If the prophecies were correct, this boy represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power. Plagueis' plan had always centered on the idea that they would have time to prepare for the Chosen One's appearance, time to corrupt or control this being before the Jedi could fully train him. But the boy was already in Jedi custody, already being evaluated by the Council. Time was shorter than Plagueis had calculated, and Sidious had come to another realization. If he waited too long, if he allowed Plagueis to survive and continue his experiments, his master might actually succeed in achieving immortality. An immortal Darth Plagueis would never be overthrown, would never give up power, would never allow his apprentice to step out of his shadow. Sidious would be trapped forever as the junior partner, no matter how powerful he became. The decision was clear. Plagueis had taught him everything worth knowing. The master had served his purpose. Now it was time for him to die. Sidious raised his hands and began channeling the Force, but instead of some subtle technique, some poison or induced failure that might be mistaken for natural death, he chose the most brutal and direct approach available to a Sith Lord. Lightning erupted from his fingertips, cascading over his master's body in writhing arcs of pure dark side energy. Plagueis convulsed in the chair, his body jerking as the lightning tore through him. His eyes snapped open, awareness returning as unimaginable agony ripped through his nervous system. In that moment of awakening, he understood everything. He saw his apprentice standing before him, face twisted in a rictus of hatred and exaltation. He felt his carefully maintained midi-chlorian network failing, cells dying faster than he could repair them. He recognized the ultimate futility of his quest for immortality in the face of this most ancient form of betrayal. Sidious did not end it quickly. He continued to pour lightning into his master, watching with dark satisfaction as the being who had shaped him, taught him, believed in him, suffered the consequences of trust. Between bursts of lightning, Sidious spoke, his words a final philosophical treatise delivered to a dying audience. All the power you accumulated, all the secrets you discovered, all the immortality you sought, and you failed to see what I saw from the beginning, Sidious said, his voice cold despite the violence of his actions. You thought we could transcend the rule of two, that we could break the cycle. But the cycle exists for a reason, Master. It ensures that each generation grows stronger, that the weak are culled and the strong survive. You had grown complacent, convinced that you had time, convinced that your plans were perfect. Plagueis tried to speak, to use the Force to defend himself or strike back, but his body was failing too quickly. He attempted to manipulate his own midi-chlorians, to repair the damage, to extend his life just a few more minutes. But Sidious was right about one terrible thing. In a body that was being actively destroyed, when the Force itself was being turned against him, his midi-chlorian manipulation techniques simply couldn't work fast enough. Your experiments on Venomous, all those times you killed and resurrected him, Sidious continued, circling his dying master like a professor delivering a lecture. Those were toys, test subjects who never resisted, who couldn't fight back even as you manipulated their midi-chlorians. But now it's happening to you, and you discover the truth. In a body being denied air, in which even the Force is failing, your own midi-chlorians can't accomplish what you're asking of them. Sidious paused, letting that truth sink in, letting his master experience the full horror of understanding that all his research, all his brilliant discoveries, all his wisdom had been insufficient to save himself. Then he unleashed another massive burst of Force lightning, this one sustained, pouring everything he had learned about the dark side into one concentrated attack. I could save you, of course, Sidious said conversationally, even as he continued the assault. I could return you from the brink, as you did with Venomous. I could repair the damage to your body, but I won't. The purpose here is not to bring you back at the last moment. The purpose is to bring you to death's door and shove you through to the other side. Plagueis' body began to fail catastrophically. His hearts, his lungs, his major organs were shutting down faster than his Force techniques could compensate. His vision dimmed, consciousness flickering like a candle in strong wind. In his final moments, he felt not just physical agony, but a deeper spiritual pain, the recognition that he had failed to achieve his ultimate goal. He would not live forever. He would not rule the galaxy eternally. He had simply been another link in the chain of Sith succession, no matter how special he had believed himself to be. And then Darth Plagueis the Wise, manipulator of life itself, died. The being who had unlocked secrets that generations of Sith before him had failed to discover, who had brought the grand plan to the brink of success, who had believed he had transcended the rule of two, simply ceased to exist. Sidious stood over his master's corpse, feeling a massive disturbance ripple through the force. It was as if the galaxy itself had shifted in recognition of what had just occurred. For a moment, Sidious felt a sensation he initially interpreted as triumph, the Force itself acknowledging him as the sole remaining master of the dark side, the culmination of 1,000 years of Sith evolution. But mixed with that sensation was something else, something that troubled him even in his moment of victory. There was a sense of loss in the Force, yes, but also a sense of recoil, as if the Force itself was rejecting what he had done, pulling back from the darkness he represented. Sidious pushed this sensation aside, refusing to give it importance. He had won. That was all that mattered. As he stood there, Sidious did briefly wonder if his master's consciousness had somehow survived. Plagueis had theorized about consciousness transference, had discussed various ancient Sith techniques for surviving death. Was it possible that even now Plagueis' awareness was lurking somewhere, preparing to take revenge on his treacherous apprentice? But Sidious was confident in his victory. If Plagueis had possessed any technique that could have saved him, the Sith Lord would have used it. The fact that he had died meant that all his research, all his experimentation had been insufficient. Plagueis had failed to achieve immortality, and in doing so had validated the ancient Sith tradition. Only the strong survive, and the master exists only until the apprentice grows stronger. Sidious made arrangements for Plagueis' body to be discovered in circumstances that would not raise questions. An apparent heart failure, tragic but not unexpected for someone who had suffered grievous injuries in the past and worked under tremendous stress. Hago Damask's business empire would be absorbed by his protege and former associate, the new Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, ensuring that all of Plagueis' resources and networks now served Sidious alone. Darth Sidious had become the sole Dark Lord of the Sith. Within a few years, he would begin implementing the final stages of the grand plan, unleashing a galaxy-wide war that would provide the pretext for reorganizing the Republic into an empire. In 13 more years, he would execute Order 66 and destroy the Jedi Order. In 19 years, he would rule the galaxy absolutely the most powerful individual alive. But he would do it all without his master, carrying forward plans they had made together while claiming all the glory for himself. The partnership that Plagueis had believed would last for 10,000 years had lasted barely 3 decades, ended by the oldest betrayal in the Sith playbook, executed on a night that should have been a celebration. In his final moments, Plagueis had learned a truth that every Sith before him had eventually discovered. Power does not protect you from betrayal. Wisdom does not save you from ambition, and trust between Sith Lords is always inevitably, fatally misplaced. Legacy and the echo of Plagueis' death, for most beings, is the end of influence. But for Darth Plagueis, death was merely the beginning of a different kind of power. Though his body was gone, though his consciousness had failed to transfer as he had hoped, the knowledge he had accumulated and the techniques he had developed would echo through the decades that followed, shaping galactic history in ways he never could have imagined. Sidious, now the undisputed master of the Sith Order, inherited more than just Plagueis' political network and financial resources. He gained access to decades of research notes, experimental data, and theoretical frameworks that Plagueis had developed during his obsessive quest for immortality. Among these materials were detailed descriptions of midi-chlorian manipulation techniques, studies on consciousness transference, and analyses of how the Force interacted with biological processes at the cellular level. Most valuable of all was Plagueis' multi-limbed droid assistant, 11-4D. This mechanical servant possessed complete records of every experiment Plagueis had conducted, every technique he had attempted, every success and failure in his research. Sidious interrogated the droid extensively, extracting information that Plagueis might not have explicitly taught him during his apprenticeship. Through this process, Sidious came to understand just how close his master had come to achieving true immortality. The discovery both impressed and unsettled Sidious. On one hand, it validated his decision to kill Plagueis. When he did, waiting even a few more years might have meant facing an immortal master who could never be overthrown. On the other hand, it meant that the key to eternal life, the ultimate prize of Sith research spanning millennia, had been within reach. Plagueis had failed to perfect the technique, but he had laid the groundwork. Sidious studied his late master's research obsessively, particularly the work on consciousness transference. He recognized that while Plagueis' approach to immortality through midi-chlorian manipulation had merit, it was too dependent on constant vigilance and control. A moment of weakness, a second of inattention, and the whole carefully maintained system would collapse. Consciousness transference, while imperfect, offered a more robust solution. If Sidious could master this technique, he could simply move to a new body whenever his current one began to fail. As the years passed and Sidious accumulated more power, first as Supreme Chancellor, then as Emperor, he continued these experiments in secret. He established hidden laboratories on worlds like Exegol, ancient Sith strongholds in the unknown regions where he could work without fear of discovery. He created cloning facilities where new bodies could be grown, vessels waiting to receive his consciousness when needed. The knowledge Plagueis had generated became central to Sidious's own bid for immortality. When Darth Vader eventually betrayed him, throwing him down the reactor shaft of the second Death Star, Sidious's consciousness survived. Using techniques derived from his master's research, he transferred his awareness into a clone body, waiting on Exegol. The transfer was imperfect. The clone bodies degraded quickly, unable to sustain his vast power for long, but it worked. Sidious cheated death, just as Plagueis had once promised was possible. During the years of the Empire, Sidious also used Plagueis' story as a tool of manipulation. The Tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise became a seduction technique, a carefully crafted narrative designed to tempt Force sensitives to the dark side. When Anakin Skywalker struggled with fear of losing Padme, Sidious recounted his master's abilities, planting the idea that the dark side offered the power to prevent death. The irony was exquisite. Sidious used the story of his master's achievements to lure Anakin into becoming his apprentice, all while concealing that those same achievements had culminated in Plagueis' murder at Sidious's own hands. The tale served as both promise and warning. Yes, such power existed, but even the wise could be betrayed by those they trusted. It was a perfect encapsulation of Sith philosophy, truth, and deception woven together so tightly that they became indistinguishable. But Plagueis' influence extended beyond just Sidious's machinations. The techniques he had developed for manipulating midi-chlorians, his theories about creating life through the Force, these had consequences that rippled out in unexpected ways. Some scholars and Force researchers have theorized that Plagueis' experiments in creating life through midi-chlorian manipulation might have been what triggered the Force to create Anakin Skywalker as a counterbalance. According to this theory, when Plagueis and Sidious attempted their most ambitious experiment, trying to create a being purely through Force manipulation of midi-chlorians, they succeeded partially, but lost control of what they had begun. The Force, reacting to this audacious violation of natural law, created its own response, a child of the Force, the chosen one, who would ultimately bring balance by destroying the Sith entirely. If this theory is correct, then Plagueis inadvertently created the instrument of his order's destruction. His quest for control over life and death spawned the being who would kill his apprentice, end the Sith lineage that stretched back to Darth Bane, and bring the prophecy of balance to fruition. It would be a fitting irony for a Sith Lord who believed he could outsmart the Force itself. After the fall of the Empire and Sidious's final death at the hands of Rey, his granddaughter, archaeologists and historians began excavating Sith sites throughout the galaxy. On Exegol, in the depths of the Sith Citadel, explorers from the Exegol Excavation Project discovered references to Darth Plagueis in what remained of Sidious's personal archives. Among these was an entry in the Arcane Library, a collection of Sith knowledge that documented the research and achievements of past Dark Lords. The file on Plagueis described him as a master of midi-chlorian manipulation who had come closer than anyone before him to achieving immortality through biological means. It noted his experiments, his theories, and crucially, his ultimate failure, killed by his apprentice before he could perfect his techniques. For historians trying to understand how Sidious had managed to return from apparent death, this file provided crucial context. The Emperor's resurrection was not entirely his own achievement. It was built on foundations laid by his master decades earlier, but perhaps the most significant appearance of Plagueis came not in historical records, but in recent events. In the time of the High Republic, over a century before the events of the Skywalker saga, a mysterious figure appeared in connection with a fallen Jedi, known only as the Stranger or Chimere. On an unknown planet, a being matching the description of a Moon Sith Lord was seen lurking in the shadows of a cave, observing the Stranger and a former Jedi Padawan named Osha Anasea. This figure, later confirmed to be Darth Plagueis, appeared frail and withered, his eyes dimly glowing with dark side energy. His presence raised profound questions about Sith succession and the true timeline of his activities. If Plagueis was active during the High Republic era, possibly as early as 132 years before the Battle of Yavin, then he was significantly older than previously believed and had been operating in the shadows for well over a century by the time Palpatine became his apprentice. More intriguingly, the Stranger appeared to be another of Plagueis' apprentices, someone trained before or possibly alongside Palpatine. This raised the disturbing possibility that Plagueis had violated the rule of two even more extensively than anyone realized, maintaining multiple potential apprentices over an extended period. It suggested a level of long-term planning and manipulation that exceeded even what historical records had indicated. The appearance of Plagueis in this earlier era also connected him to another mystery: the creation of the twins, Osha and May. These children had been created through the Force by their mother, a technique eerily similar to what Plagueis had been researching throughout his life. Did Plagueis learn of these twins and study their creation, using this knowledge to further his own experiments? Or had he somehow influenced their creation in the first place, conducting experiments across multiple generations? These questions remain unanswered, but they paint a picture of Darth Plagueis as perhaps the most influential Sith Lord in the final 1,000 years of the Order's existence. His research shaped Sidious's approach to power. His techniques enabled the Emperor's return from death. His experiments possibly triggered the creation of the Chosen One. His manipulation extended across generations, influencing events a century before his death. In the grand scheme of the Sith's long history, Plagueis represented something unique. He was neither the strongest Sith Lord others like Darth Revan or Darth Vitiate likely exceeded his raw power. He was not the most successful politically. That distinction belonged to his apprentice, Sidious. He did not rule the longest, or win the most battles, or create the most devastating Sith artifacts. What Plagueis did was push the boundaries of what Force users understood about life itself. He explored the deepest biological foundations of Force sensitivity. He asked questions about consciousness, mortality, and the nature of existence that others had avoided because the answers were too disturbing. He pursued knowledge with a scientist's rigor and a madman's obsession, willing to commit any atrocity if it advanced his understanding. His legacy is not one of conquest or domination, but of forbidden knowledge that continues to echo through the Force. Every Sith who came after him, every dark side user who sought to extend their life or cheat death, walked paths he had mapped. Every experiment with cloning and consciousness transference owed something to his pioneering work. The very possibility that death could be overcome, that the Force could be bent to preserve consciousness beyond biological limits, traced back to the research of Darth Plagueis the Wise. In the end, Plagueis' story serves as both inspiration and cautionary tale. His brilliance was undeniable. He genuinely did unlock secrets that had eluded Force users for millennia. His dedication to his research was absolute, uncompromising in its pursuit of truth, regardless of moral cost. But his wisdom, despite the title bestowed upon him, was fatally flawed. He was wise enough to uncover the mechanisms of life and death, but not wise enough to see betrayal coming from someone he trusted. He was brilliant enough to develop techniques that could resurrect the dead, but not brilliant enough to apply those techniques to save himself when the critical moment arrived. He understood the Force at a level few others could match, but he failed to understand the fundamental truth that the Force will not be mastered, only partnered with, and that attempts to dominate it completely will inevitably lead to destruction. Darth Plagueis believed he could transcend the rule of two, that he could break the cycle of betrayal that defined the Sith. In his arrogance, he thought his relationship with Sidious was different, that their partnership would endure where all others had failed. He died learning what every Sith Lord eventually learns, that ambition acknowledges no loyalty, that power recognizes no sentiment, and that among the Sith, even wisdom is no protection against the ultimate betrayal. His body lies forgotten, buried somewhere in the sprawling cityscape of Coruscant, or disposed of in a manner that left no trace. His name is known primarily as a legend told by Palpatine to seduce Anakin Skywalker. His achievements, while real and significant, have been overshadowed by the more dramatic events of the Clone Wars, the fall of the Jedi Order, and the rise and fall of the Galactic Empire. Yet for those who study the Sith, for those who seek to understand the dark side of the Force, Darth Plagueis remains a figure of profound importance. He represents the ultimate expression of a certain approach to the Force, the scientific, rationalist method taken to its logical extreme. Where Jedi sought harmony with the Force and other Sith sought dominance through raw power, Plagueis sought understanding through experimentation, knowledge through analysis, control through comprehension of underlying mechanisms. His research, his theories, his experimental data, all of this remains scattered throughout the galaxy in hidden archives and forgotten laboratories. The complete scope of what he achieved and attempted may never be fully known. But his influence persists, a dark legacy that continues to tempt those who believe they can succeed where he failed, who think they can unlock the final secrets of life and death, who imagine they can be the one to finally achieve true immortality. And so the story of Darth Plagueis the Wise ends not with a definitive conclusion, but with a lingering question that every Force user must eventually answer for themselves. Is the power to control life and death worth the price that must be paid to achieve it? Is the quest for immortality a noble pursuit or a fool's errand? Can wisdom coexist with ambition, or does the pursuit of ultimate power inevitably corrupt even the wisest of beings? Plagueis believed he had found the answers. He died, discovering he was wrong. But somewhere in the galaxy, in hidden archives or forgotten data files, his research waits. And there will always be those who find those notes, study those techniques, and believe that where Darth Plagueis failed, they will succeed. The dark side has always promised such things to those willing to pay its price, and it has never lacked for new acolytes willing to make the attempt. The legend of Darth Plagueis the Wise lives on, not as a tale with a clear morale or an uplifting message, but as a reminder of what is possible when brilliance is combined with ruthlessness, when scientific inquiry is divorced from ethical restraint, and when the pursuit of knowledge becomes an end in itself regardless of consequences. He was a monster, certainly, but he was a monster who genuinely expanded the boundaries of what Force users understood about life itself. And in the morally complex universe of the Sith, that combination of atrocity and achievement makes him perhaps the most fascinating Dark Lord of his era. Closing thoughts. The story of Darth Plagueis is, at its core, a story about the price of ambition and the ultimate futility of trying to control the uncontrollable. This Moon Sith Lord achieved more than most beings dare to imagine. He unlocked secrets of the Force that had remained hidden for millennia. He built an economic empire that influenced galactic affairs across dozens of sectors. He recruited and trained an apprentice who would eventually rule the galaxy itself. By any objective measure, Darth Plagueis was extraordinarily successful. Yet he failed in the only goal that truly mattered to him. He died. After decades spent researching immortality, conducting experiments that would horrify even the most hardened observers, and developing techniques that genuinely could extend life and prevent death in others, he could not save himself. The supreme irony of Darth Plagueis the Wise is that his wisdom was insufficient to recognize his greatest danger until it was too late to matter. His story resonates because it speaks to fundamental human concerns. We all fear death. We all want more time to accomplish our goals, to see our plans fulfilled, to avoid the ultimate limitation that mortality places on our ambitions. Plagueis represents the logical extreme of that desire, the being who refused to accept death as inevitable and dedicated his entire existence to overcoming it. That he failed despite his brilliance makes his story a tragedy. That he was betrayed by the very apprentice he trusted most makes it a quintessentially Sith story. In the grand narrative of Star Wars, Plagueis occupies a unique position. He is important, not for what he did directly. He never commanded armies into battle, never destroyed planets, never publicly opposed the Jedi Order. His importance lies in what he enabled. Without Plagueis, there would have been no Darth Sidious as we know him. Without his training and resources, Palpatine would have been just another ambitious politician, unable to conceal his Force sensitivity, unable to execute the plan that would bring down the Republic. The Empire, the Clone Wars, the destruction of the Jedi Order, even the corruption of Anakin Skywalker. All of this traces back to choices Plagueis made decades earlier. He was the architect of his own destruction, but also the architect of the greatest Sith triumph in 1,000 years. That both legacies spring from the same source, from the same brilliant, flawed mind, makes Darth Plagueis one of the most complex and compelling figures in Star Wars lore. As we drift off contemplating the darkness that Plagueis embodied, perhaps we can find a strange comfort in his failure. The lesson of his story is that even the most powerful beings are not omnipotent, that even the wisest can be deceived, that even those who unlock the deepest secrets of existence cannot fully control their destiny. There is a kind of reassurance in that, a reminder that the universe contains forces that transcend individual will, no matter how strong. Darth Plagueis the Wise sought to become a god. He ended up a cautionary tale, and in that transformation from genius to legend, from master manipulator to murdered master, he became immortal in a way he never intended, not through eternal life, but through the story that would be told about him, the legend that would tempt and warn future generations, the name that would be spoken in hushed voices whenever someone wondered just how far a being could go in pursuit of power. Sleep well, listeners, and remember, not even the wise can cheat death forever. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Sith history, please leave a like and subscribe to Sith Lore. Let me know in the comments which Sith Lord you'd like to hear about next. Until then, may the dark side be with you.